Imagine you are standing on the deck of a small wooden merchant vessel, hastily converted into a warship with cannons bolted to its sides, sailing directly toward the most powerful fleet in the history of the world. The year is 1775. The British Royal Navy has over 270 warships, tens of thousands of experienced sailors, centuries of naval tradition, and enough firepower to level entire coastal cities in a single afternoon. And you have 8 ships. 8, not 800, not 80. 8 converted merchant vessels crewed by fishermen, dockworkers, and farmers who had never fired a naval cannon in their lives. Every single military strategist on the planet, from London to Paris to Madrid, looked at this situation and said the same thing. This war at sea is over before it begins. America cannot win. America will not win. And yet, somehow, impossibly, against every law of military logic and common sense, America did win. This is not just a story about ships and cannons. This is a story about desperation becoming strategy, about audacity becoming a weapon, about a nation that refused to accept the verdict that history had already written for it. This is the story of the Continental Navy versus the British Royal Navy, and it is arguably the greatest underdog naval story ever told in the history of human warfare. To understand just how impossible this situation truly was, you have to go back to the very beginning, back to a time before the United States of America even existed as a legal entity, back to the raw, burning anger of the American colonies in 1775. The relationship between Britain and her American colonies had been deteriorating for years, rotting from the inside out like a ship's hull eaten by barnacles and salt water. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, each one a fresh wound, each one pushing ordinary American men and women closer to the edge of something irreversible. By the time the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the colonies were not just angry. They were ready to fight, ready to bleed, and most importantly, ready to die for something they believed in more than life itself. The problem was they were ready to fight on land. Nobody in America had seriously thought about fighting at sea. And that was a catastrophic oversight because Britain was, at its very core, a naval empire. You have to understand what the British Royal Navy meant to the world in 1775. This was not simply a military organization. This was the single most powerful institutional force on the face of the earth. The Royal Navy had been forged over 2 centuries of continuous naval warfare, through battles against Spain, against France, against the Dutch, against the Ottoman Empire. British sailors were the most experienced, the most disciplined, the most battle-hardened maritime warriors alive. Their ships were engineering masterpieces, massive oak fortresses bristling with iron cannons, capable of crossing entire oceans and delivering devastating broadsides with clockwork precision. The largest British ships of the line carried over 100 guns, 100 cannons on a single vessel. These ships were so powerful that smaller navies would sometimes surrender at the mere sight of them appearing on the horizon. Because what was the point of fighting? You don't throw yourself against a mountain and expect the mountain to move. And the numbers made the disparity even more terrifying. By 1775, the Royal Navy had approximately 270 ships of various classes in commission or available for service. They had frigates that could outrun anything the Americans might build. They had ships of the line that could absorb punishment that would have sent American vessels to the bottom in minutes. They had supply chains, naval bases, experienced admirals, detailed charts of American coastal waters, and the full financial and industrial backing of the most powerful empire on earth. Against all of this, against this mountain of steel and oak and experience and tradition, the American colonists decided, with breathtaking boldness and perhaps more than a little madness, to build a navy. The story of how the Continental Navy came into existence is one of the strangest, most improvised, most brilliant pieces of military bureaucracy in American history. It did not begin with grand speeches in the halls of the Continental Congress, though those would come. It began with a single man, a single governor, and a desperate practical need. In October of 1775, Rhode Island delegate Stephen Hopkins stood before the Continental Congress and made an argument that most of his colleagues thought was either brilliant or insane, and nobody was entirely sure which. Hopkins argued that without a navy, the American war effort was doomed. British warships were already prowling American coastal waters, disrupting supply lines, threatening port cities, and landing troops wherever they pleased. The Americans were fighting with one arm tied behind their backs. They needed ships. They needed them now. And remarkably, the Congress agreed. On October 13th, 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the acquisition and fitting out of 2 armed vessels. Just 2 ships. This is the date that the United States Navy officially counts as its birthday. October 13th, 1775, a date born not out of confidence or strength, but out of sheer necessity and desperation. 2 weeks later, Congress expanded this authorization to 4 ships. Then committees were formed, budgets were debated, and the agonizingly slow machinery of revolutionary government began to grind toward the creation of something that had never existed before, an American Navy. But here's the thing about building a navy from scratch in the middle of a war. You do not get to wait for ideal conditions. You do not get to spend years designing the perfect warship, recruiting the perfect sailors, and training under control conditions. You take what you have, you arm it as best you can, and you send it into the water and hope. The first ships of the Continental Navy were not purpose-built warships. They were merchant vessels, commercial ships that hauled cargo and fish and timber along the American coast, hastily converted by installing gun ports and bolting cannon to their decks. The flagship of the 1st Continental Squadron was the Alfred, a converted merchantman that had previously sailed as the Black Prince. She carried 24 guns and flew the Grand Union flag from her mast, the first official American naval ensign, a flag that represented a nation still trying to figure out exactly what it was. The man who would command this first American naval squadron was Isaac Hopkins, a Rhode Island mariner and privateer whose appointment as commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy was itself a study in the politics of the Revolutionary period. Hopkins was not chosen because he was the most qualified naval officer in America. He was chosen because of a complicated mixture of political connections, regional representation, and the simple fact that he was willing to do an extraordinarily dangerous job for uncertain pay and even more uncertain prospects. He would prove to be a controversial and ultimately tragic figure in American naval history, a man whose one great success was also the beginning of his undoing. Before we go any further into the story of the Continental Navy's battles and campaigns, we need to talk about the other crucial element of American naval power during the Revolution, the element that is often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic story of the Continental Navy itself. We need to talk about privateers. Because if the Continental Navy was America's regular fighting force at sea, privateers were America's secret weapon, the hidden blade that Britain never quite figured out how to defend against. Privateering was a perfectly legal and widely accepted practice in the 18th century. A privateer was a privately owned vessel that carried a letter of marque, a government license that authorized it to attack and capture enemy merchant ships. The owners and crews of privateers were not pirates. They were licensed predators, and the distinction mattered enormously, both legally and practically. Over the course of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress and the individual American states would issue letters of marque to over 2,000 privateering vessels. 2,000. Compare that to the couple dozen ships the Continental Navy managed to field at its peak, and you begin to understand the true scale of American naval activity during the Revolution. These privateers ranged up and down the Atlantic coast, crossed to the Caribbean, sailed into British home waters, and created a level of commercial disruption that caused genuine economic pain in Britain itself. But let us return to that first American naval squadron in the winter of 1775 and 1776, because what happened next was one of the most extraordinary operations of the entire war. Isaac Hopkins assembled his little fleet, 8 vessels, the largest of which was a converted merchantman, and set sail with orders to clear the British from Chesapeake Bay and then proceed south to the Carolinas. Hopkins looked at his orders, looked at the state of his fleet, and made a command decision that would have impressed a much more experienced admiral. He ignored his orders entirely, not out of cowardice, not out of confusion. He ignored his orders because he had received intelligence about a target that he believed was worth more than anything Congress had instructed him to pursue. On the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, British had stockpiled a significant cache of military supplies. Cannon, mortars, and most precious of all to an army fighting with barely enough gunpowder to sustain itself, a substantial quantity of naval stores. Hopkins decided to raid Nassau, the colonial capital of New Providence, and bring those supplies home to the Continental Army. It was a bold plan, audacious even, and in March of 1776, Hopkins led the first American naval expedition in history. The raid on Nassau was not the thunderous naval battle that Hopkins might have hoped for. The British garrison, small and lightly defended, offered only token resistance. Hopkins landed 270 Marines and sailors, the first amphibious operation in American naval history, and the town of Nassau fell almost without shot. What Hopkins found in the British warehouses was not quite as magnificent as the intelligence had suggested. The governor of New Providence, a man who clearly understood the value of time, had already loaded the most critical supplies, particularly the precious gunpowder, onto ships and dispersed them to other islands before the Americans arrived. Hopkins still managed to carry off a substantial haul of cannon, mortars, shells, and various military stores, enough to make the expedition worthwhile. But the gunpowder he had come for was gone. On the return voyage, Hopkins demonstrated that his fleet could fight as well as raid. Off Block Island, in April of 1776, his squadron intercepted the British warship HMS Glasgow, a 20-gun frigate that had been cruising in American waters. What followed was one of the most embarrassing performances in the history of the Continental Navy and simultaneously one of the most revealing windows into the challenges the Americans faced at sea. Hopkins had 8 ships. Glasgow had 20 guns, significantly outclassed on paper by the combined firepower of the American squadron. And yet Glasgow fought off the entire American fleet for several hours, inflicting casualties, surviving broadside after broadside, and eventually escaping into the darkness. The Americans had fired hundreds of rounds and had precious little to show for it. Ships collided with each other. Gunners loaded improperly. Coordination was essentially non-existent. It was a reminder, if any were needed, that having ships and having a navy were two very different things. But let us talk about the man who would become the soul and the symbol of the Continental Navy, the figure whose name has echoed through American naval history for nearly 2.5 centuries. John Paul Jones. Before he was a legend, before he was a hero, before he became the father of the American Navy, John Paul Jones was simply a Scottish-born merchant mariner named John Paul, who had come to America seeking a fresh start and found instead a revolution that needed exactly what he had to offer. His adoption of the surname Jones, added to his birth name to create the famous identity we know today, was itself a kind of reinvention A man remaking himself as America was remaking itself. Jones was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Continental Navy in December of 1775, and from the very beginning, it was clear that he was different from the other naval officers around him. Where others were cautious, Jones was aggressive. Where others thought defensively, Jones thought offensively. And where others saw the Continental Navy as a defensive force, a tool for protecting American shores, Jones had a vision so audacious that it bordered on lunacy. Jones wanted to take the war to Britain itself, not to attack British ships in American waters, not to defend American ports from British bombardment. He wanted to sail to the British Isles, to raid British ports, to attack British shipping in British home waters, to make the population of Britain feel, in their bones and in their pockets, the cost of this war. This idea was, by any conventional military analysis, completely insane. And it was also, in retrospect, military genius. In April of 1778, commanding the sloop of war Ranger, Jones put his plan into action in a series of raids that shocked the entire British Empire. He crossed the Atlantic and appeared off the coast of Scotland and England. He raided the port of Whitehaven on the English coast, spiking the cannon of the harbor fort and attempting to burn the shipping in the harbor. The fire was extinguished before it caused major damage, but that was almost irrelevant. The psychological impact of an American naval officer landing on British soil, attacking a British port, was devastating. Britain had not been raided on its own shores since the Dutch wars of the previous century. Suddenly, people in coastal British towns were boarding up their windows and posting lookouts, afraid of the American pirate, as they called him, who might appear at any moment. Then Jones did something even more remarkable. He crossed to Carrickfergus in Ireland and attempted to capture the captain of a British naval vessel to use as a hostage for the exchange of American prisoners of war held in British jails. The specific target, the Earl of Selkirk, escaped capture, but Jones once again demonstrated that nowhere in British home waters was safe from American naval action. The British public was furious. The British Admiralty was embarrassed. And across France and the rest of Europe, where people had been watching the American Revolution with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism, the name John Paul Jones suddenly meant something extraordinary. But all of this was merely preparation for the most famous moment in the entire history of the Continental Navy, a battle that happened not because of careful planning or strategic advantage, but because of the sheer, impossible, volcanic will of one extraordinary man. In September of 1779, commanding a converted French merchant vessel that he had renamed the Bonhomme Richard in honor of Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, Jones encountered a British convoy being escorted by the warship HMS Serapis, a brand-new 44-gun frigate, off the coast of Flamborough Head on the Yorkshire coast of England. This battle would become one of the most famous naval engagements in history, and it would produce the single most quoted line in American naval tradition. The Bonhomme Richard was, to put it generously, not an ideal warship. She was an old French merchant vessel, over a decade of age, with rotting timbers, leaking seams, and an armament that was both underpowered and dangerously unreliable. Two of her largest guns, 18-pounders on the lower deck, would actually burst during the battle, killing their own crews and blasting holes in her hull. Against this tired, aging, leaking vessel stood the Serapis, freshly built, powerfully armed, crewed by the finest sailors in the world. When the battle began on the evening of September 23rd, 1779, the outcome seemed predetermined. Serapis had more guns, heavier guns, faster loading rates, and a crew in significantly better physical condition. In the opening broadsides, the Richard took catastrophic damage. Water poured into her hull. Fires broke out. Men died by the dozen. At some point in the chaos of that night battle, illuminated by moonlight and the flickering orange glow of burning ships. The British captain of Serapis, Richard Pearson, called out to Jones across the water, asking if he had struck his colors, the naval signal for surrender. Jones, standing on a deck that was literally on fire and sinking beneath his feet, gave the reply that would echo through centuries of American military tradition. He said, in words that have been recorded with minor variations, but the same essential defiant spirit, I have not yet begun to fight. What followed was over 3 more hours of the most savage close-quarters naval combat of the entire 18th century. The two ships literally lashed themselves together so that neither could escape. Cannon fired at point-blank range, muzzle to muzzle, through shared gun ports. Marines fired down from the rigging onto the decks below. Men fought with pistols, cutlasses, pikes, and bare hands. The Bonhomme Richard continued to sink throughout the battle, and Jones continued to fight. When Serapis finally struck her colors and surrendered, Jones had won a victory so impossible, so contrary to every military prediction and probability, that even his enemies in Britain could not entirely suppress their admiration. But here is the brutal, heartbreaking truth that sometimes gets lost in the heroic legend of John Paul Jones. He won the battle for Bonhomme Richard. He lost the ship. The Richard, too damaged to save, sank 2 days after the battle. Jones transferred his flag to the captured Serapis, the ship he had just beaten, and sailed away in his prize. It was a victory that illustrated perfectly the paradox at the heart of the Continental Navy's entire war. The Americans could fight with extraordinary courage and achieve remarkable individual victories. But sustaining those victories, building on them, converting tactical success into strategic dominance, that was a different challenge entirely. Now we need to talk about a dimension of this naval war that is absolutely essential to understanding how America actually managed to survive and ultimately win. We need to talk about the alliance with France, because without France, the Continental Navy's courage and brilliance would almost certainly have not been enough. The French entry into the American Revolutionary War, formalized by treaty in February of 1778, fundamentally changed the strategic equation at sea. France had the second most powerful navy in the world, and France had centuries of accumulated hatred and strategic rivalry with Britain that made the American cause a perfect vehicle for French national interest. When France entered the war, Britain suddenly had to divide its naval attention between American waters, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, European home waters, and the approaches to India and the Far East, where French and British commercial and colonial interests clashed. The Royal Navy, for all its overwhelming power, could not be everywhere at once. And this was exactly the strategic leverage that American survival required. The French fleet gave George Washington's army the one thing it could not create on its own: the ability to temporarily control the sea lanes along the American coast at critical moments. Which brings us to the battle that actually decided the Revolutionary War, a naval engagement that most Americans have never heard of, a battle that does not have the romantic drama of Bonhomme Richard versus Serapis, but which was without any question the most strategically decisive naval engagement of the entire conflict. The Battle of the Chesapeake, fought on September 5, 1781, sometimes called the Battle of the Virginia Capes. This engagement between a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse and a British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves was, by the dramatic standards of naval combat, a relatively inconclusive tactical affair. The two fleets battered each other for 2 hours. Neither side was destroyed, and the fleets disengaged without a clear tactical winner. But strategically, the Battle of the Chesapeake was the most consequential naval engagement in American history, because what it decided was not which fleet would survive. What it decided was whether the British Army under Lord Cornwallis trapped on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia, would be resupplied and reinforced, or whether it would be left to starve and surrender. When Graves failed to break through the French fleet and reach Cornwallis, when the British warships turned away and headed back to New York, the fate of the Yorktown campaign was sealed. Cornwallis was surrounded by Washington's army on land and blocked by de Grasse's fleet at sea. He had no avenue of escape and no hope of relief. 6 weeks later, on October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army of 8,000 men, the largest British army in North America, to George Washington. The Revolutionary War was, for all practical purposes, over, and it had been decided not by a heroic land charge or a famous speech, but by a naval battle that most people cannot name, fought between a French fleet and a British fleet off the coast of Virginia on a September afternoon in 1781. But to focus only on these major engagements is to miss the full texture and the full cost of what America attempted at sea during the Revolution. We need to talk about the ordinary sailors of the Continental Navy, the men whose names did not make it into the history books, whose courage was no less real for being uncelebrated. These were men who signed up to serve on ships that were obviously inferior to their British counterparts, for pay that was often months in arrears, under conditions that were brutal even by the rough standards of 18th century maritime life. The food was inadequate, the quarters were cramped and filthy, disease was a constant companion, and the prospect of a British cannonball ending your existence without warning was a daily reality. Why did they serve? Some came for prize money, the share of captured vessels and cargo that could, in theory, represent life-changing wealth for a common sailor. Some came out of genuine patriotic conviction. Some came because the alternative, starvation ashore in a wartime economy, was hardly more appealing. But whatever their individual motivations, these men represented something genuinely extraordinary. The willingness of ordinary people to attempt extraordinary things because the cause demanded it. Consider the situation of the average Continental Navy sailor in comparison to his British counterpart. The British sailor served on a ship that had been purpose-built for war, with gun decks designed for maximum firepower efficiency, with timbers thick enough to absorb punishment, with supplies maintained by the most sophisticated naval logistics system in the world. The Continental sailor served on a converted merchant vessel with guns bolted to a deck that had been designed to carry cargo, not to absorb cannon fire. The British sailor had access to the full resources of the Royal Navy's worldwide support network, naval bases, hospitals, supply depots. The Continental sailor might go months without seeing a friendly port, might be forced to purchase supplies at inflated wartime prices with continental currency that was already losing value at a terrifying rate. And then there was the matter of British naval blockades. As the war progressed, and Britain committed more and more naval resources to the American theater, the blockade of American ports became increasingly effective and increasingly devastating. Ships trying to enter or leave American harbors ran a gauntlet of British warships. Commerce was strangled. Supplies from Europe, desperately needed by both the Continental Army and the civilian population, were intercepted at sea. The privateers, for all their success in disrupting British commerce, could not by themselves break the blockade. Only a naval force powerful enough to contest British control of American coastal waters could do that, and for most of the war, no such force existed. There is something else about this naval war that deserves serious attention, something that the traditional narratives of American heroism and British villainy tend to obscure. The Revolutionary War at sea was extraordinarily brutal for American prisoners of war. When Continental Navy sailors or privateer crews were captured by British forces, and many hundreds were, over the course of the war, they faced conditions that bordered on deliberate extermination. The British prison ships anchored in Wallabout Bay near New York, most notoriously the HMS Jersey, which American prisoners called simply the Hell Ship, were among the most horrifying facilities in the history of American warfare. Thousands of American prisoners died on these ships, not from enemy action, but from disease, starvation, and deliberate neglect. Estimates of the total death toll on British prison ships range from 8,000 to 11,000 men, more American deaths than in all the land battles of the Revolution combined. These men, these forgotten thousands, deserve to be remembered as much as any hero of land or sea, because their suffering was as much a part of the price of American independence as any cannon shot fired in anger. And speaking of price, let's talk about the financial cost of what the Continental Navy attempted, because it illuminates both the desperation and the determination of the American cause at sea. Building and outfitting even a single frigate was an enormously expensive proposition by the standards of the 18th century. Timber, canvas, rope, iron fittings, artillery, ammunition, provisions for the crew. The cost added up with terrifying speed. The Continental Congress, perpetually short of money, perpetually arguing about how to finance the war, found naval expenditure to be one of the most contentious items in its budget debates. When you're struggling to pay and feed an army that is starving and deserting at Valley Forge, it is genuinely difficult to justify spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on ships that might be sunk or captured before they accomplish anything meaningful. And yet the Congress kept funding the Navy, kept authorizing new vessels, kept the dream of American sea power alive, even when the practical results were limited and the costs were enormous. That determination, that refusal to accept the strategic reality that a powerful Navy was beyond American means, was itself a form of courage. The Continental Navy also gave America something that is easy to underestimate from the comfortable distance of 2.5 centuries: credibility. When John Paul Jones sailed into European waters and raided British ports, when American frigates captured British merchant ships inside of the British coast, the message that went out to the courts of Europe was that America was a serious military power, not merely a collection of rebellious colonists who would be suppressed within a season or two. This credibility was absolutely essential to the diplomatic campaign that Benjamin Franklin was conducting in Paris, a campaign aimed at convincing France to formally enter the war on the American side. Every Continental Navy success, however small by the standards of conventional naval warfare, was ammunition in Franklin's hands, evidence that America could contribute meaningfully to a joint military campaign against Britain. Without that credibility, without those demonstrations of naval courage and competence, the French alliance that ultimately decided the war might never have been secured. Let us also talk about the relationship between the Continental Navy and the individual state navies, because this is a layer of American naval history that is almost entirely forgotten today. Each of the 13 colonies maintained, at various times, its own naval force, small squadrons of gunboats, galleys, and armed vessels designed to defend local waters and rivers. These state navies range from genuinely significant military forces, like those of Pennsylvania and South Carolina, to essentially token gestures with a handful of barely armed boats. The coordination between the Continental Navy and the state navies was, to put it diplomatically, often problematic. Different chains of command, different political priorities, different standards of training and discipline, all of these factors meant that American naval power was even more fragmented than the raw numbers suggested. At a time when unity of command and concentration of force were essential to any hope of challenging British naval dominance, American naval power was scattered across dozens of different organizational structures, each answering to a different authority. The story of the Continental Navy is also inseparable from the story of the shipbuilding industry that tried, under extraordinarily difficult wartime conditions to supply it with vessels. American shipyards, particularly those in New England, had been among the most productive in the British Empire before the Revolution. The forests of New England provided excellent shipbuilding timber, and the maritime culture of coastal New England produced skilled craftsmen who understood every aspect of ship construction. When the Continental Congress authorized a building program of new frigates in 1775, 13 frigates in total, it was placing enormous faith in these shipyards and these craftsmen. What followed was a story of heroic effort, terrible frustration, and ultimate tragedy. The 13-frigate program was plagued from the start by shortages of every material that shipbuilding required. Iron for fittings was in short supply because British blockades were cutting off European imports. Canvas for sails was scarce. Skilled workers were diverted to other wartime industries. Money arrived in unreliable installments that left contractors unable to pay their workers. Ship after ship sat in the ways, partially framed, waiting for materials that were weeks or months away. Some of the frigates were eventually completed and launched, serving with distinction before being captured or destroyed. Others were burned on the stocks to prevent capture as British forces swept through American port towns. The waste was heartbreaking, not just of money and materials, but of hope and effort. Let us spend some time on the individual stories of the ships that did manage to fight, because in those individual stories, you can see both the brilliance and the heartbreak of the Continental Navy's experience. The USS Randolph, a 32-gun frigate commanded by Captain Nicholas Biddle, was one of the finest vessels in the Continental Fleet, and Biddle himself was perhaps the most professionally accomplished of the Continental Navy's early captains. In March of 1778, off Barbados, Randolph encountered the British 64-gun ship of the line HMS Yarmouth, a vessel so much larger and more powerful that any rational commander would have run. Biddle chose to fight. For nearly half an hour, Randolph traded broadsides with a ship twice her size, inflicting real damage on Yarmouth and demonstrating the extraordinary courage of her captain and crew. Then a British shot found Randolph's powder magazine. The explosion was so enormous that it was heard for miles, and the Randolph was utterly destroyed, with nearly all of her 300-man crew, including Captain Biddle, killed instantly. Only 4 men survived, clinging to wreckage for 4 days before being rescued by the very British ship that had destroyed them. It was a tragedy that captured, in one shattering moment, both the courage and the impossibility of what the Continental Navy was attempting. Then there was the USS Trumbull, whose story illustrates the grinding, unglamorous struggle just to keep ships operational and crews together. Trumbull spent over a year trapped in the Connecticut River, unable to cross the sandbar at the river's mouth because her draft was too deep when fully loaded. When she finally got to sea, she proved herself a fine fighter, engaging the British privateer Wood in June of 1780 in one of the bloodiest single-ship actions of the war, with casualties exceeding 30% of her crew. She was eventually captured in August of 1781, her crew ravaged by disease and her hull in desperate need of repair, unable to escape a British squadron that any healthy, properly manned frigate would have outrun easily. Now let us go deeper into the world of the privateers, because their contribution to the American war effort was not just military. It was economic and psychological and diplomatic all at once. The privateers operated on a different logic from the Continental Navy. They were not primarily fighting for political principle or strategic position. They were fighting for profit, and that profit motive made them extraordinarily aggressive and innovative in ways that a regular military force could not always afford to be. A privateer captain who captured a fat British merchant ship loaded with sugar, spices, or manufactured goods could make enough prize money in a single cruise to set himself and his crew up for life. This created a powerful incentive to seek out and attack British commerce wherever it could be found, from the coastal waters of Britain itself to the Caribbean sugar lanes to the transatlantic routes between Britain and her global empire. The economic damage that American privateers inflicted on British commerce over the course of the Revolution was genuinely staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that American privateers captured between 600 and 800 British merchant vessels over the course of the war, with a combined value that represented a significant fraction of Britain's total annual merchant trade. Insurance rates for British ships crossing the Atlantic skyrocketed. British merchant companies, which had enormous political influence in Parliament, began lobbying for a negotiated peace as the costs of continuing the war mounted. The Lloyd's of London insurance market was being hammered by American privateering in ways that made the war economically painful for the British middle class in a very direct, personal, financial sense. This economic pressure was, in its own quiet way, as important to the ultimate American victory as any naval battle. There is a remarkable and little-known chapter of the Continental Navy's history that deserves more attention than it usually receives: the operations of American naval forces in European waters, not just John Paul Jones's famous raids, but the sustained effort to bring the war to Britain's doorstep in ways that would force the British government to reckon with the full cost of the American conflict. When Jones arrived in France in late 1777 with the captured British sloop Drake, a prize taken in those famous Irish Sea raids, he was not merely delivering a captured vessel. He was delivering a message, visible and undeniable, that American naval power could project itself thousands of miles from American shores. The French government, watching this demonstration with immense satisfaction, became significantly more willing to formalize the alliance that Franklin had been negotiating for months. Benjamin Franklin's role in the Continental Navy's history is one that is rarely acknowledged, but it was absolutely critical. As the American minister to France, Franklin served as the de facto logistics officer and diplomatic liaison for American naval operations in European waters. He arranged for the acquisition and fitting out of vessels in French ports. He navigated the extraordinarily complex diplomatic minefield of American warships operating from French ports while France was technically still neutral in the early years of the war. He corresponded constantly with Jones, with Congress, and with the French government, managing a triangular relationship of competing interests and fragile agreements that required every gram of his legendary diplomatic skill. Without Franklin's patient, brilliant, tireless work in Paris, John Paul Jones would have had no base from which to operate in European waters, and the Continental Navy's European campaign would never have happened. As we approach the final chapters of this story, we need to talk about what became of the Continental Navy after the Revolution ended, because the ending is as surprising and instructive as anything that came before. After Yorktown, after the formal peace treaty of 1783, the Continental Congress made a decision that seems, from a modern perspective, almost incomprehensible. They sold the last ship of the Continental Navy. They disbanded the Navy entirely. The very institution that had contributed so materially to American independence was liquidated, its ships auctioned off, its officers released from service. Congress, facing enormous war debts and deeply suspicious of any institution that might form the basis of centralized federal power, decided that a permanent navy was an unaffordable luxury that the young republic did not need. The Continental Navy, which had begun with nothing and fought with everything it had, simply ceased to exist. It would take another decade and a half, and the humiliating experience of American merchant ships being seized by Barbary pirates and French privateers in the 1790s, before Congress would authorize the creation of a permanent United States Navy in 1794. But the institutional memory, the tactical experience, the understanding of naval warfare that the Continental Navy had purchased at such enormous cost in blood and treasure survived in the men who had served it. When the USS Constitution was launched in 1797, when the new American Navy went to war against France in the Quasi-War and against the Barbary States in the First Barbary War, it was building on a foundation that the Continental Navy had laid, imperfectly but indelibly, during those desperate years of revolution. The legacy of the Continental Navy is not the legacy of a fleet that dominated the seas or drove the Royal Navy from American waters. Its legacy is something more complex and more profound. It is the legacy of what a determined, creative, outnumbered force can accomplish when it refuses to accept the limitations that its enemies assume will contain it. The Continental Navy never expected to defeat the Royal Navy in the open ocean. It never tried to. What it tried to do, and what it ultimately succeeded in doing, was to make British sea power expensive, uncertain, and contested at a time and in a way that mattered to the outcome of the war. It disrupted British commerce. It carried war to British home waters. It maintained the psychological credibility of the American cause at moments when that credibility was desperately needed. And it helped secure the French alliance that provided the decisive naval power at the Battle of the Chesapeake. There is something else about the Continental Navy that resonates deeply across the centuries, something that speaks to the character of a nation that was defining itself through this very struggle. The men who served in the Continental Navy knew, better than anyone, how outmatched they were. They could see the size and quality of the ships they faced. They knew the reputation and experience of the officers commanding those ships. They understood, in the most direct and immediate way possible, the disparity between what they had and what their enemy had. And they sailed anyway. They loaded those borrowed, converted, inadequate cannon. They stood on those leaking, burning, sinking decks, and they fought with everything they had because the alternative, surrender, submission, the abandonment of the idea that was just beginning to call itself America, was worse than death. John Paul Jones himself, in a letter written years after the Revolution, captured something essential about the spirit that animated the Continental Navy when he wrote about what qualities made a true naval officer. He described a man of liberal education, of extensive knowledge of mankind and things, of the nicest sense of personal and national honor, and the genuine patriotism that can distinguish the actual interests of his country from the imaginary interests of the moment. Whether or not any given Continental Navy officer fully embodied this ideal is beside the point. The ideal itself, the sense that naval service was a matter of character and commitment as much as skill and firepower, gave the Continental Navy a psychological edge that partially compensated for its material disadvantages. The final accounting of the Continental Navy's war is one that historians continue to debate, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. In purely military terms, the balance sheet is mixed. The Continental Navy lost far more ships than it captured. It never seriously challenged British control of American coastal waters. Several of its most significant operations ended in disaster, most catastrophically at Penobscot Bay in 1779, where a combined Continental and Massachusetts naval force of over 40 vessels was annihilated by a much smaller British squadron, one of the worst American naval defeats in history. A catastrophe that destroyed more ships than any other single engagement of the war and humiliated the American cause at a critical moment. But in the broader strategic accounting, in the context of what the Revolutionary War actually required to win, the Continental Navy's contribution was essential and possibly irreplaceable. The privateers disrupted British commerce to an extent that influenced British domestic politics. The Continental Navy's raids on British home waters influenced French decision-making at a critical diplomatic moment. The combined effect of American naval activity forced Britain to deploy resources to coastal defense and commercial protection that might otherwise have been concentrated against the Continental Army. And at the crucial moment, the French Navy, whose entry had been influenced in part by the credibility that American naval operations had established, won the Battle of the Chesapeake and sealed the fate of the British Army at Yorktown. This is the story of America's impossible first naval war, a story that begins with 8 ships and ends with a nation, a story that contains within it some of the most extraordinary individual acts of courage in the entire history of naval warfare. The sinking fighting of the Bonhomme Richard, the raid on Whitehaven, the defense of the Randolph, the thousands of quiet, uncelebrated acts of seamanship and bravery performed by ordinary men on inadequate ships in dangerous waters. But it is also a story about strategy, about the creative use of limited resources, about the way that a determined underdog can find and exploit the vulnerabilities of a superior opponent, not by meeting that opponent on his own terms, but by changing the terms of the conflict entirely. The Continental Navy could not defeat the Royal Navy. So instead, it made the Royal Navy's victory impossibly expensive. And sometimes, in war as in everything else, that is enough. The next time you see the American flag flying over a United States Navy warship, the most powerful naval force in the history of the world, understand that the tradition it represents, the tradition of courage under impossible odds, of fighting when fighting seems futile, of refusing to surrender even when the deck is literally on fire beneath your feet. That tradition was born not in the age of aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, but in the age of wooden ships and iron men, in the desperate, extraordinary, improbable adventure of the Continental Navy against the British Royal Navy, in the years when America was nothing more than an idea that a handful of sailors decided was worth dying for.